Once the whole island of Britain spoke some version of the Brythonic language that ultimately became Welsh. That includes the part of Britain now known as Scotland, not to mention the part now known as England. Linguists wish they understood the history of Celtic languages better than they do, but that much is widely accepted. I know I talk a lot about this in my videos, so I'm not going to labor the point here. Even Pictish is in this group, although so little of it survives that it's hard to tell how different it was from other Brythonic language of its day. Among the things that aren't clear to us is whether Pictish language and culture were always different than the Brythonic culture further south, or whether the north-south division of Britain by the Romans, building Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall, caused a cultural and linguistic split, which sent the north and the south on different trajectories. It's fair to say that we have a very limited understanding of the culture of any part of Britain before the Romans arrived. We don't know much about what it was really like for the natives while the Romans were here, and definitely not much about the cultures immediately after they left. The Iron Age morphed into the so-called Dark Ages with very little historical record. Roman influences can be very roughly divided into three zones. Much of the southeast of what's now England was Romanized. Let's face it, that probably affected your daily life a lot more if you were a member of the nobility or lived in a city, and a lot less if you were just plowing fields and milking cows. Moving somewhat north and west, the middle zone was more of an occupied territory. Some people will have been enthusiastic supporters of the Roman project, especially if they stood to gain from it. So, some of the nobles and merchants, for the most part. There was probably a lot more outright resistance in this area, a lot more attempts to subvert the Roman intentions more quietly, and probably a rural underclass who were too busy farming to give it much thought unless there was an actual battle in their cow pasture or they got an unexpected tax bill. North of the walls, well, this was the area the Romans quickly gave up on, always saying, yeah, we'll get around to conquering that bit when the weather improves, or words to that effect. The people in the north were aware of the Romans, but it was mostly business as usual, which no doubt created an interesting zone in the area of the walls. Borders can be lawless places where there's a lot to play for and a lot of opportunity to play. The English-Scottish border was famous for this for many centuries. You nipped over the border, stole some cattle, herded them back to your side, where the law of the neighboring country couldn't reach you. Things probably weren't that much different in earlier times, once the Romans started losing their grip. For example, it seems that warlords in southern Scotland were paid protection money by the Romans in the form of chopped up silver treasure. Chopped up because it was paid by weight. Those northern barbarians were effectively taxing the Romans. Oh, how embarrassing. In fact, it's a question as to whether there would have even been an England and a Scotland if the Romans hadn't built those walls. Before the Romans came, the island of Britain was just a patchwork of small kingdoms or tribal territories, all jostling for power and land. All of Europe was like that. There was no France, Germany, or Spain yet either, in the sense that we mean it. After the Romans left, things pretty much reverted to that state, with one possible difference being that the powerful leaders in the wall zone had probably gained in wealth and military might. They were rich, they were powerful, and they were heroic, at least to hear their bards tell it. But there was still no England or Scotland. In the 5th century, there were several famous kingdoms with famous leaders in this area. Strathclyde, Altclede's most famous king was Hryderchael. Irin, son of Kinvarch, ruled a kingdom called Hreged, which probably included parts of Cumbria, Ayrshire, and Galloway. In the east, the Gododin held sway over the Lothians, and probably a good deal more. Among their leaders were Clydno Aedin and Mynyddag Mwynfawr. We can see from their names that all these regions were still Brythonic speaking, even though much of the territory was in what is now Scotland. The words of two famous poets from this time and place still survive today. Taliesin, who came originally from Wales, served as the court bard of Urien of Rheged. He wrote about Urien's greatness as a leader and about some of his battles. In the east, the poet Aneurin commemorated the final great battle of the Gododin warriors who were slaughtered when they attempted to take a stronghold at Cattaraith in North Yorkshire. These heroic kings and their followers didn't think in terms of nations, only in terms of what territory they could hold, what gains they could make, and what power they might consolidate. This culture, its history and literature, doesn't fit neatly into a box. We might call it the Brythonic culture of southern Scotland and northern England. Descriptive, but a bit of a mouthful. We can't delineate its borders because it was never an official place. It didn't have borders. Within a few centuries, there was an influx of Irish invaders or settlers from the west and Anglo-Saxons from the east. More and more Gaelic came to be spoken in Strathclyde and Pictland, and Germanic dialects developed in the east. Cumbria and Strathclyde were Brythonic outposts for a while, but were eventually cut off from their Welsh-speaking cousins further south. It was in Wales that the idea of the Old North, the phrase yr hen ogledd, was born. And above all, we have the poets and storytellers of Wales to thank for this. Because the language continued to be spoken in the area that became known as Wales, the poems of Taliesin and Aneurin were preserved and honoured. The kindred and associates of Urien of Rheged, Rhyther Kyle of Strathclyde, and Clydno Aidan were eulogized, and their life stories turned into great legends, which in turn fed the Arthurian cycles of the Middle Ages. It was the Welsh who looked back with fondness and nostalgia for the lost Brythonic culture and kingdoms of the north, and who began to call it yr hen ogledd, the Old North, to distinguish it from North Wales. I get a lot of comments on my videos about the Old North from people living in the region on both sides of the new border. They often tell me that they didn't know about the Old North and the Brythonic history of their own region, or perhaps they do know, but they mention how it's not taught in school. Meanwhile, for many of my Welsh friends, their thinking about yr hen ogledd is kind of like an American thinking about Shakespeare or Beowulf. Oh yes, old difficult poetry about a time and place that's hard to even imagine. Yet, because the literature of the Old North is in a form of Welsh, they naturally feel like it belongs to them. And in a way, they're right, because they've been taking care of it for a long time for the rest of us. My Welsh friends are only partly right, because folk in southern Scotland and northern England are still standing on the land where all these things happened. They can go for a walk anytime and climb up the ramparts of an old fortress and say, I'm looking out over the territory of Rhyther Kyle or Mynyddoch Mwynfawr. If you live in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Leeds, or Carlisle, this is part of your heritage. It's your heritage if you're in Clackmannan or Penrith or Alnwick or Leicester. And I say you should claim it, and I know the Welsh would be glad of your interest. Many people don't know about the history I've just shared with you. They tend to think that there's nothing Celtic about England and that Scotland is some kind of Ireland light because of the Gaelic language. It's certainly true that England has a lot of influence from the Anglo-Saxons and then the Normans. That influence doesn't stop at the modern national borders. It's felt in Scotland and Wales too. Scotland and Cumbria and lots of other places also have considerable Norse influence, while the Irish influence on Scotland is undeniable. They gave us a language after all. If, as a modern person, you feel particularly aligned with the modern nation of Scotland or England, for example, there's nothing wrong with that. And if you're basing your spirituality or what choice of deities you honor on where you live in Britain, then be aware that Britain has long been a melting pot, and the land you live on has probably seen deities from more than one culture honored. Which doesn't mean that you must do the same. It just means to be open to the possibility. Be aware that other modern pagans in your area may be interested in those deities. If you live far from Britain and you feel a pull to ancestral deities, try to understand the historical nuance. The ancestors you can trace may have a place in Scotland or a place in Northern England on their birth certificate. But if you could trace their ancestors back into the pre-Christian past, they wouldn't even understand the concept of Scotland and England. It's also likely that at least some of those ancestors of your ancestors were migrants of one kind or another. They may have been conquerors, opportunistic settlers, or displaced people. Some people say you can figure this out with DNA, but the truth is that DNA can cause a lot of confusion and misunderstanding. My advice is this: when it comes to deities and spirituality, follow the thing you're drawn to and don't feel that you need to justify it. But once you've picked something, then it's your responsibility to understand it and the ancient and modern versions of the culture associated with it. Understand that there are layers of cultural and religious history imprinted on any given geographical area. It's good to walk with that awareness.